You have seen on the agenda there are lots of questions about financing Action to Zero. I will not repeat them. Our challenge is really about resourcing the very ambitious transformation. Somebody used the word radical this morning. To deal with it. Some studies say tens of trillions of dollars are needed for infrastructure investments. That will happen anyway, and a few trillion will actually make it climate compatible. So we are not dealing with a completely impossible task. We just have to sort of look for ways how it will be done. The range of people here is big. We have climate bonds. We have a representative from an LDC, landlocked LDC in Africa. We have the new Green Climate Fund representative. We have GIZ, and we have the IID, and we have a pre-recorded message from Pension Denmark. So let me just quickly introduce the panel, and then we'll start with a question session. And I will certainly like to also open the floor for discussion after a couple of rounds of talks back and forth. We have here Nanki from IID, principal researcher from the climate change team. We have Xing Fu-Bertaux, who is a climate finance specialist at the GIZ. We have, I never get your name quite right. Ousseynou. Yeah, I again can't find your name. Yeah, Ousseynou Nakoulima, Director of Country Programming at the Green Climate Fund. We have Alex Muselima, who is replacing Dr. Rose Mukan-Komeje, who is still on the plane, couldn't reach us early. But Alex comes with ample experience to describe what's going on in Rwanda. And we have Sean Kidney, who is the CEO of the Climate Bonds. And with that, I really and I have actually sent these panelists and respondents 3 questions which are a bit more focused than the ones given on in our agenda. First one, what are the challenges from your own perspective, on the perspectives of your own institution or country, in shifting the flow of public and private investments towards climate-compatible options? Number 2, what have you actually done to promote a transformational shift in the flow of financial resources towards low emission and climate resilient pathways? And third, how can we, others, help you to get there, or how can we help others? So I think we could start with a lay of the land a little bit, and I would like to ask Alex really to describe to us a little bit the challenges faced by an African landlocked LDC in the face of this vast question of how are we actually going to resource our 0-0 within a generation.
Thank you. As we have been introduced to, I'm Alex Mulisa from Rwanda, and I coordinate the Fund for Environment and Climate Change, one of the few African finance mechanisms for climate change and green growth. Challenges, I don't know how much the audience is familiar with Rwanda, very small country in the Central Africa, just south of Uganda, east of Congo, for those who are familiar with big countries. It's landlocked, and that presents its own specific challenges in terms of even accessing energy. Most of the energy supply comes from, fossil fuel based, and therefore we have to go long distances in terms of bringing fossil fuels, diesel, petrol, to power generators to provide energy. And I'm sure the audience here is very familiar with the challenges that abound in that, in the sense that there is the carbon footprint all the way involved in transportation. There is then the powering of generators So energy-intensive requirements have placed special conditions for Rwanda to be aware of the challenges that we are talking about here in the climate change arena. The other thing is Rwanda is densely populated. It has the highest population pressure density in Africa, the whole of Africa. And as a result, the poverty issues, subsistence agriculture is the source of livelihood for over 90% of the people. Fuel wood use has seen deforestation, and all those issues converge to kind of bring poverty as well as the emissions we are talking about in terms of climate change issues at head. So the issues are intractable when it comes to how we can benefit from any initiatives, financing, policy, or otherwise, and how we deal with the poverty in terms of fostering our economic growth, addressing rural poverty. A whole range of issues come together to put us at the center stage of the dialogue for how climate change and poverty can be dealt with in tandem.
Thank you. We know that Rwanda has done a lot in terms of resource mobilization. I think we could come to that in the next round. The world responded, well, Copenhagen decided to establish the Green Climate Fund, and we are now happy to know that actually it is operational, and it has been now capitalized with a lot of pledges. It would be interesting to hear from Ousseynou really where you see yourself in what are your main aims, what are you responding to primarily as a Green Climate Fund?
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Alex, for this great example. Well, the Green Climate Fund has been created to make transformational, I would say, to transform the way we deal with climate change, and also to target vulnerable countries and vulnerable populations. So the example Alex gave is a great illustration of why the fund has been created. As you see, climate change makes development challenges even more difficult to tackle because climate change increases the variability, and as we know, development is also about increasing predictability and reducing this variability. So the way the fund has been structured, it will hopefully address these issues. And if I may summarize it in one word, it would be trying to be catalytic. The needs are huge. The fund, even though the capitalization, as you said, has been very successful so far, and it's still ongoing. It's about, now we are almost at $10 billion of pledging. This amount will be far from sufficient to address all these needs. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of needs. So the way we have been structured to address this is to have a catalytic approach. If I may illustrate it in a figurative way, I would say that if you look at today the flows of finance at the level of institutional investors, at the level of pension funds, in the public as well as in the private sector, we have funds that are looking for investment targets. However, there are barriers that prevent these funds to flow in developing countries and also to flow in sustainable investments. So our role is to try to unlock these barriers. And the way we want to do it is a very innovative way. It's actually to pull all resources, but when I say resources, I mean intellectual resources in the world, by reaching out to countries through implementing entities. And these implementing entities are not only supposed to manage projects and funds for us, but also, and very importantly, are supposed also to bring new ideas that will trigger this unlocking of barriers. So I may elaborate more later in the discussion, but this is fundamental in our approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So the word catalytic is there. We know that the current pledge of 10 billion is nowhere near enough, and the world needs the sort of reshaping of the flows from business as usual to climate compatible options in the forms of trillions. We'll come back to the role of banks later, but there is, of course, then the world of institutional investors and the really large amounts of money that are needed. And let's get into that discussion by first screening a video from the CEO of Pension Denmark, who unfortunately wasn't able to come here, but was very interested in contributing. So let's get into that, and then we'll hear about the role of climate bonds after that.
Denmark has chosen to invest in renewable energy and energy infrastructure, and why these types of investments make perfect sense for a pension fund. But allow me initially to introduce Pension Denmark. We're a not-for-profit labour market pension fund covering more than 630,000 individuals employed in 27,000 companies within the private and public sector. Assets under management are growing rapidly and are currently at $25 billion US. Today I'm going to talk about why we believe it makes sense for a pension fund to invest in these types of assets and what we've actually done. In an era of record low interest rates, investments in government bonds destroy purchasing power for our policyholders because they simply can't keep up with inflation. Putting all the funds in equity and high-yield bonds is too risky, especially for individuals who are close to retirement. So we need to seek out other investment opportunities that will transfer and enhance purchasing power from working life and into retirement. Investments in infrastructure, including renewable energy and energy infrastructure, can provide just that. The projects typically have a very long investment horizon, making it possible for us to ripen the illiquidity premium associated with that type of investment. And if the projects have a feed-in tariff or similar structure, earnings will be stable and predictable, as well as being independent of the business cycle. This makes the investment a good complement to other more cyclical assets. It's unsustainable for energy and utility companies to raise funds for the transition to a low-carbon energy production themselves. Instead, they're looking at capex reduction, asset divestment, and a refocusing on core business. And given the current state of the finances of most governments, funding for green energy investments will be limited, and in any case much smaller than needed to fulfill the investment requirement. Therefore, attracting institutional investor capital will be of the essence. Pension Denmark has a fiduciary responsibility to secure its members the best possible return on investments and mitigate risks. This also provides the opportunity to take on investments with a longer time horizon in illiquid markets, hence utilizing the benefits in ripening the illiquidity premium of the market. By investing directly in the assets, as opposed to indirect investments in infrastructure funds, we're able to avoid high management fees and also obtain much better control and insight into the risk profile of our investments. At Pension Denmark, we're doers. We've invested directly in a number of offshore and onshore wind farms in Denmark and the United States. Through funds, we've invested in solar parks, energy storage and smart grids. Together with EKF, the official Danish export credit agency, we've provided financing for loans that are given to companies that buy Danish exports. The first deals were used to finance exports of wind turbines produced by the Danish manufacturer Vestas. Hence, our investments in this area total more than $1 billion, and we've committed an additional $2 billion for investments in infrastructure, including renewable energy, over the coming 4 to 5 years. Let me give you a couple of examples. In 2010, we bought a 30% stake in Anholt offshore wind farm here in Denmark. It's a turnkey project that will be completed in late 2013, containing 111 Siemens 3.6 megawatt turbines. The actual production from the park is equivalent to the energy consumption of 400,000 Danish households. This year, we've bought half of 3 operational US wind farms from the German utility E.ON. The wind farms are located in Texas and Pennsylvania and have a production capacity of 433 megawatts. These are just 2 specific examples of direct investments in renewable energy. Finally, let me reiterate that in our opinion, investing directly is the best way to tackle large renewable energy investments. However, there are many private equity funds that specialize in the seed, venture and overall market for new green technologies. They play a pivotal role in developing these companies and thus promote the refinement of these new technologies. And we've invested in several of them, including US funds such as Energy Capital Partners and Technology Crossover Ventures. Overall, these funds, which contain very specialized knowledge on identifying the right technologies for the future and developing the companies that are working to refine them, are attractive investments for pension funds and other institutional investors. Of course, the general private equity fund model has been challenged by the financial turmoil of the past couple of years. Typically, they'll now need a much larger share of equity finance, and leverage has come down significantly. In the short term, this has led to fewer investment abilities in this segment of the market, but we believe that in the long run, it'll strengthen the sector's ability to invest in new green technology.
So here we had a progressive Nordic pension fund talking. I don't know how much we can generalize this to the rest of the institutional investment world, but I would also like to hear at some point from the panelists, does this resonate for you? Is this something that is relevant in your opinion about in the discussion that we're actually having? But we're now turning to Sean Kidney, who has founded an initiative where there's a lot of hype around climate bonds. People talk now a lot about them, and many of us don't necessarily understand them very well. So please give us some insights.
So you don't like the sound of it? Did you say, Ari? Did you? I didn't quite hear the last bit. Climate bonds, green bonds. You'll see both terms used, largely interchangeable so far globally. A little bit of a difference in the US, where the odd municipality brings in a few quirky things into their green bonds. But it's about 98% climate. Green is a slightly easier marketing term in places where climate is not so high on the agenda, such as Midwest US or China or India. We're an investor-focused NGO. Our objective is to mobilise the $100 trillion bond market for climate solutions. To give you a sense of scale, the equities market, that's stocks and shares, is $63 trillion. The US economy is a $17 trillion economy per annum. So it's a fairly large slice of the world financial system. It's the instrument of choice for infrastructure, the financial instrument of choice. The sewers of London in the 1870s were built of bonds. The railways of the US around the same time. The highways of the US again in the 1960s and again and again and again. Hasn't been used very much for climate. What in the world were we thinking? How did we miss that one? Well, this becomes particularly obvious when you start looking at the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook, which, if you haven't read it, on climate is a fantastic document. $53 trillion required between now and 50 to avoid catastrophic climate change. I will tell you, the chief economist of the IEA doesn't believe we're going to avoid catastrophic climate change. He's very sanguine about world leaders. He believes we are on a direct trajectory to 6 to 7 degrees warming and doesn't put out much hope for Paris. I'll let you be the judge of that. However, they say that if we invest this money, 53 trillion, above what is already a very large investment need globally, because countries like Rwanda, India, China, Indonesia are building infrastructure, we can save $115 trillion in fossil fuel inputs. That's a saving, folks, that we make at the end of the day, if we could turn it into the funding at the beginning. And, of course, we address climate change, but perhaps more directly relevant, we enter a new era of low-cost renewable energy, with solar and probably wind well below fossil fuel prices. That will change the global dynamic if we're able to achieve that. You know what the other road is. That's the road we're on now. 6 to 7 degree warming, not much actually happening, catastrophe at the end of the century for emerging markets in particular. Investors understand this. Surprisingly, $45 trillion of investors are represented on the Principles for Responsible Investment. $24 trillion worth of investors, these are large numbers, signed a statement at the UN Climate Summit calling for governments to act decisively on climate change. It's not the first time they've done it, but at least they're doing it. We have on our own standards board, climate bond, green bond standards, to provide some quality, a fair trade mark to this particular sector, $30 trillion represented. So we have a fair amount of rhetorical buy-in, but it is rhetorical because it's hard for them to justify taking a risk. They have legal obligations to pay your pension funds and my pensions in 10, 30, 5 years in my case, but REs may be longer, etc. Now, if they don't meet those requirements, they're in trouble with the law. So they say, we're keen to invest, we need product we can invest in. That is an enormous opportunity for governments. But governments have been thinking that this is a carbon problem and a pricing problem. Actually, it's not, according to the IEA. It's a green infrastructure problem. The bulk of what has to be done around the world is infrastructure. It's energy, it's transport, it's the cities, it's water in the adaptation side. When we start thinking along those lines, we think, oh, hang on, we've got a whole other toolkit we can use. We've been doing this for the last 150 years around the world. We built the highways of Europe using infrastructure funding. None of it is free market. It all requires governments to act decisively to ensure the right kind of infrastructure that meets society's needs is built. Planning, rezoning, guarantees sometimes, direct funding through the European Investment Bank, represented by my friend Chris Knowles in the middle there, etc., etc., etc. Every treasury in the world knows what the toolkit is. They're not currently using it. They need to use it, and we need to use it globally. Rich countries can use exactly the same tools they use in Europe to buy down interest rates in India and make solar competitive. Solar's hard to make competitive because it's a very high interest rate environment. You know, a 20-year financing scheme for a large solar plant in India, something like 2/3 of that is interest. If you could reduce the interest from 12% to 6%, you save 1/3 the lifetime cost of that particular project. Now that is incredible. And you know what? Guess where we got low interest rates? In his country. Hey, there's a deal to be made here. We all know that. And the world is, by the way, awash in capital. There ain't no shortage of money, folks. The European Central Bank has, on deposit from Siemens, 16 billion euros because Siemens don't know what to do with it. And that's just the corporate. These pension funds and insurance funds have $88 trillion under management and a shortage of yield. That means they can't get deals that pay a reasonable interest rate. Hey, it sounds simple. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated. But at least we know where the solution lies. This is not the realm of the Climate Investment Fund or the Green Climate Fund direct lending. We need to use those funds to help leverage private sector capital in areas that we decide are important for policy reasons. Green bonds are part of that. But it's not just rich country money either. China has its own money. I'm on a committee of the People's Bank of China looking at growing a green bonds market in China. They have the money. They need the instruments. They are planning to have massive growth in this area next year. In India, India actually has all the capital it needs. It's just it's in the wrong place. It's in property. There's a vast property bubble in India, and gold. A third of the world's gold is around the necks of Indians. That is not a good place for capital. I'd call that capital misallocation. Now, there are some macroeconomic strategies we can use to attract that capital into productive investments, and that's the kind of area we need to be looking at. And it's not just the big countries. Zambia has a pension fund, a big one. It only really invests in government bonds because none of the green infrastructure projects in Zambia look safe enough for them. Fair enough. We're not going to change their perceptions very easily, but I'll tell you what, KfW could come in and provide a bit of credit enhancement for the green infrastructure, the solar farms, the railways, and make them suitable for the local pension fund, avoiding foreign exchange risk, and so we can tap domestic capital in emerging markets as well. There's a lot we can do here to finance the stuff that's got to be financed. It's not that hard, guys. We've been doing it for 150 years. Let's not be blinded by the utter failure of the last 20 years of our climate negotiations. Let's look where the agenda has actually been all along, just in the bottom drawer of Treasury.
We'll certainly come back to you later, Jean. Before I get to our respondents, I wanted to get a little bit of a feel from Alex. How has Rwanda actually mobilized? What is your strategy? And does this seem esoteric and too far away, or is this something where what you've just heard here now could also be a part of the solution for your country?
Okay, thank you again. So having looked at the challenges we have faced as a country, a subsistence agricultural country, the energy constraints, poverty, how do we plan to come out of it? We have registered economic growth to the average of around 8% for the last 5 years, but it hasn't made much headway in terms of alleviating poverty. So the government of Rwanda sat down, it's like, what should we do? What should be done? And policy is at the heart of it, but more importantly, implementation of the policies in place. I mean, very many countries have policies, but translating those policies, and good ones at that, but translating good policies into implementable strategies and activities is what we feel has made a difference for us. We have a Vision 2020, which has all the right stuff in terms of targeting, including halfway 2020 and 2010, it was actually revised for climate, to include climate change targets. Why was this so? Because of the growing body of knowledge that our economy, growing at 8%, could grow even more, if not even slow down, if we don't take into account the impacts of climate change. So this vision is translated into medium-term strategies. In our case, it's called the Economic Development and Poverty Reduction. We registered for the very first poverty reduction strategy that ended in 2012. We took 1 million people out of poverty, and that is very significant considering we are only 11 million people. And that came as a direct result of translating policies we have in place into actions. One of the things that is defining for us on the climate change poverty front is the fact that we have come up with a green growth and climate resilience strategy that was approved by cabinet, cross-sectoral in nature, and it also came out of the evidence that our economy is seriously undermined, our economic growth is seriously undermined by the impacts of climate change. Rwanda is a hilly country in addition to all other factors I've talked about. When it rains heavily, we lose our soil. There's a saying, common saying on the streets in Kigali, that we export soil to Egypt. And that is how intense soil erosion is, and undermines agricultural productivity, and therefore undermines economic growth. So in order to face these issues, we believe that the strategy that we have in place which projects up to what we should be doing by 2050 in order to make a difference in our economic growth, in our development trajectory. How do we put this strategy into action? And that is where climate financing actually came in. One of the ways for implementing this, besides looking at the institutional coordination mechanisms and how they can be improved to enhance operationalization of the strategy, we have a sustainable financing mechanism that in the form of a national fund for environment and climate change. One of the, we have talked of climate financing, the internationalization of it, but for Rwanda, we have chosen to start at the national level. This is a fund for Rwanda. How do Rwandans capitalize the fund before we even look outside? And so we have two tracks. We have the domestic capitalization of the fund, where natural resource taxes, environmental impact assessment, payment for ecosystem services are some of the mechanisms that have been used to capitalize this fund at a domestic level. Matter of fact, even the Ministry of Finance puts in money into the fund direct from the government coffers to capitalize this fund, important as it is to our economic growth. But we have also been fortunate that the development partners at the national level, in the forefront being the DFID, UK government, has put in significant resources to operationalize the fund and to also support the projects. So what Green Climate Fund is doing right now is a welcome gesture, but it is something that we at the national level have been struggling with, at least in terms of how do we ensure that we address climate change issues, transition to green economy. Right now, with the operationalization of the fund, we believe that we are well set to be able to address some of the serious issues coming from climate in terms of enhancing climate resilience for our populations at the rural development level. The governance structures are in place which are also critical to making all these things work. And the Green Climate Fund is a welcome opportunity for us to be able to actually leapfrog into accessing significant resources. We have not stopped there. Our private sector is very much part of what we have targeted for this fund. Matter of fact, we believe that the longer term, this fund is going to be to cater mostly for private sector as well as mobilize resources from the private sector, which is what has been talked about. We are into heavy infrastructure, energy projects, and that cannot be done effectively and successfully without the involvement of private sector. So what has this fund done? We have a private sector window where we have two instruments. There is the grant component, which addresses research and development, proof of concept, piloting. But we also have a loan component with the partnership of Rwanda Development Bank. And matter of fact, we so far have 2 energy projects that have accessed through the loan program, which reduces interest rate for private sector to be able to make this fund attractive for them, but more importantly, to address the issues of climate resilience and invest in green projects, the kind of infrastructure that we've been talking about, the green buildings, the renewable energies. So what I can say in a nutshell is the fact that for any country that means business in terms of addressing climate change, it must emerge at the national level through policies that can be implemented and are implementable to ensure that a cross range of stakeholders are part of the process. And then we can, as countries, as different institutions, be able to position ourselves for opportunities like a Green Climate Fund, even to work and work much better. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe a quick question to Ousseynou. How do you relate to, does the GCF have sort of plans with to work with the outside capital market and the banking sectors? How do you relate to, you talked about leveraging and scaling up. How do you intend to do that?
Yes, thank you, Ari. I think these are two great interventions and very much consistent with why the fund was created. Let me tell you this. I think, and this is also one of the assumptions of the fund, there is no contradiction between supporting the public sector and supporting the private sector. And there is also no contradiction between supporting countries at a global level in terms of economy and supporting vulnerable populations at the local level. On the first point, one of the key features of the fund, as I said before, is to be catalytic. And the way we want to do it, just to react to one of the interventions and also the video, would be to provide instruments that can allow this credit enhancement and allow investors and incentivize institutional investors to invest in developing countries. One example would be to provide, for instance, completion guarantees, because very often institutional investors would shy away from investing in infrastructure because there is this period of the development of the infrastructure where there is a lot of uncertainty, which is before completion. So we could provide completion guarantees. The second thing I wanted to say regarding these institutional investors, well, when you are, for instance, the CFO of a company, your job is to hedge also the company against many different types of risks. So you would take, for instance, instruments, financial instruments, to hedge against the foreign exchange risk or the interest risks. And I think when you are the Minister of Finance of a country, your job also entails this kind of responsibilities. You would try to hedge the economy of your country against certain risks, including climate risk. Because if you want to raise long-term financing, you will have to convince investors that your country is protected against certain adverse events. So it means that you need to address this climate change risk if you are to mobilize these funds at the global level. And this is where also the Green Climate Fund can bring value. And I wanted just to say a third thing regarding these institutional investors. We want to be innovative, and one way we are thinking about, and I'll be very happy to also hear from the audience some ideas, would be to address the needs of cities. Because very often, and this was also said at the opening session of this COP, cities are at the forefront of climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. And cities are more and more mobilizing funds at institutional from the institutional investors. So we are very keen on working with cities in developing countries, large cities as well as smaller cities, in order to structure the right type of investments. Yeah, the last thing maybe is to address the question of vulnerable populations. Two things. First, as I said, there is no contradiction between supporting the government and addressing the needs of very localized population, and that's also one of our mandate. And I'm very happy because the fund has been structured in such a way that it can work through very large international organizations like multilateral development banks, as well as local NGOs. And this is one key innovative feature of the fund. So I'll stop there and maybe come back later on.
Thank you for enlightening. I think people have so many questions about the GCF because it's so new, and you, for instance, mentioned about cities, and the subnational angle is really interesting, and I'm sure many people will be very pleased to hear that. Let's get to our commentators here. Let's hear from Sin first. really your experience and views on maybe also reacting to what you've heard until now, and perhaps some examples of what's going on in your field.
Thank you very much, Ari. I think we've been hearing a lot of exciting remarks about the significant amount of funding that is needed to trigger transformation in our economies to make them climate resilient and low carbon, as well as the existence of the giant pool of money that is there and that is waiting basically to be also mobilized in that domain. But at the same time, I think that we've been hearing that the size of the projects that we're thinking about is very variable, and that it's not only about those large investment projects that we have in mind with those, but it's also about the smaller projects. And I think one challenge in achieving this type of transformation is actually to connect the largest investors with this type of smaller projects and to make them attractive also for the largest investors, despite the fragmentation and the higher transactional costs that would imply. So I think one crucial actor in this financing chain, as Ousseynou mentioned, is the role of financial intermediaries and the type of implementing entities that are able to use those international funding and also to plug them into the system, into the national financial system. So it's not only about directing the finance of the largest supply of the funds, but it's also to find those type of intermediaries who are already plugged into the financial system and to achieve transformation through those actors. I wanted to share some remarks from a survey that GIZ has collaborated with the IFC in trying to understand how such financial intermediaries, rather small financial intermediaries, are already understanding environmental and social risk as well as climate change opportunities and how they're able to integrate those type of risk into their risk management frameworks. So we surveyed 56 lenders in 7 countries, and we found that over 1/3 of the banks had experienced significant loss in their portfolio, in their investments, linked to environmental risks. Most common cause were defaulted loans. There were some issues also with devaluated collaterals, but basically the awareness in the financial sector with environmental and social risk is already there. So what can we do about this? And there I wanted to share an example maybe from the work that GIZ has been doing with NABARD, the National Agricultural Bank of India, in developing their capacities to develop with climate change adaptation and mitigation in their investment activities. So basically what we did was to have a basic systematic capacity development program for the bank staff at the top management, but also for the bank's officers in order to increase their understanding of the climate change issues generally, but also technically what it means for the bank's investment. And then the second thing that we've been collaborating with NABARD and that we are collaborating with NABARD right now is to identify business opportunities for NABARD on financial products for adaptation and for mitigation. And the last thing, of course, is also to look for international sources, such as the Adaptation Fund, and we've supported NABARD in getting accreditation to the Adaptation Fund. So I think working with those type of actors, working to achieve transformation through them, would be one way of linking the giant pool of money and the funds that are available in the international scene, market, with the size of projects that we really need to find a way of financing to achieve an impact on the ground.
Thank you. Let's move to Nanki also for your similar sort of reflections from your own experience.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you for all your comments. I'm going to take the first one, which you were focusing on the challenges in shifting the flow of public and private investment towards climate-compatible development. So we've heard quite a few examples of what these challenges are. Based on our work, I think I would summarize them broadly into two broad challenges. The first one has a lot to do with the fact that even though the financing has begun and there are huge pots sitting out there, a lot of this current financing or climate finance is not necessarily appropriate for addressing the financing needs of low carbon climate resilient development in developing countries. So I think the first point is more in line with what Alex has highlighted, that for a lot of developing countries, this transition very much is a poverty reduction agenda first. And we are now aware, with a lot of assessments done by the OECD or the UNFCCC, that current financial flows are firstly targeting mitigation. Almost more than 90%, I think, target mitigation. A lot of this is investment in renewable energy, but it's not, you can't take it for granted that they will have co-benefits for poverty reduction or will be targeting the most poor or the most marginalized. They have to be designed explicitly to do that, and that hasn't really started happening as yet. We also know in the flow of finance that a lot of the finance that we are talking about is not necessarily flowing to developing or least developing countries. It does stay in the country of origin. So be that India, China, or Europe. It's not necessarily flowing to these other countries. Within the sort of current financing, we are also aware that a lot of the financing currently is not long-term finance, which is something that I think institutional investors have a great role to address this gap. But current funding is quite projectized and short-term, very much in line with sort of existing political cycles, a lot of the public finance at least. So that's one of the challenges that I think is important. And then related to this is what are developing countries doing to try to address this challenge? And there comes the second one, which is around the enabling environment. So within that, I think issues that are emerging is sort of whether countries have, their sort of markets are ready to actually leverage or pull down on this finance that's flowing. Whether the particular product in question has a market or the country itself has a market that's ready. Ethiopia, for example, is not completely liberalized, so it can't access a lot of this foreign direct investment that we are talking about. There are questions about data availability in a lot of these countries. Data that's required to actually calibrate a lot of these investments, be it weather-based risk insurance, which is one of the main instruments, or guarantees, which we all talk about have a huge potential. They all need data to calibrate them, which is currently lacking, so is a challenge. And the last one, which I think a lot of countries are gearing up to, is the question of readiness at the country level to actually access this finance. There are quite a few loops that countries have to go through to actually access this finance in terms of fiduciary risk management, etc. And that's where using, I think, financial intermediaries that have the capacity is an important starting point. So
Thanks a lot. I think now that we've had a round of discussion from all our participants, maybe we could go back to Sean and see how do you react to it? How do you see the role of what you've talked earlier about in poverty alleviation? Really, do climate bonds address poverty?
Let me give you an example of a project we're working on in India. Telangana state, new state, has a program to do $8 billion of solar-powered agricultural pumps over the next 5 years. They're looking to figure out how to finance it. One of the options we're looking at is producing a green bond or a series of green bonds. We have scale here. It's a large project. It's driven by the state. There are savings to be made because at the moment state subsidies going to diesel used to power these pumps, so the fuel subsidy, which can be recouped over time. So there's already some state money available. It looks like we'll be able to do a series of $1 billion bonds, which means they're big enough to work for institutional investors. They will require state guarantees, so it'll be a state bond, and it'll probably require an international development finance institution to give it some credit uplift if it's going to work overseas, unless we think we can make it work for domestic investors, which is a question mark going forward. Now, that's going to be financed with a bond largely. It's going to achieve some enormous benefits locally. At the moment, power is intermittent. So people who are doing irrigation get up in the middle of the night when the power comes on to quickly turn all the pumps on. Scorpions, snakes, there's quite a high death rate. Two, because they can't manage the water efficiently as they would like to for agriculture, they have to cope with power outages, they don't get the productivity they want. Telangana State thinks they can raise agricultural productivity in those areas by up to 50% with just a simple solution like this. Plus, there's an extra revenue stream. The farmers, when they're not using the solar to power the pumps, will feed it back into the grid or back into village microsystems. So it's an amazing project. The scale, what allows it to be funded by the bond market, and of course the support of government entities. It gives you a good example of the role of governments and development finance institutions. So that's an example. Aggregation of small projects is a critical factor, but don't dismiss this as too hard. On the contrary, we have in the US and in other developed markets a ream of examples of how to aggregate small distributed loans into large-scale financial instruments that can tap cheap money in the capital markets. It will require some work. It will require development banks to change what they do to facilitate these vehicles and effectively buy up loan portfolios from microfinance or small banks or state institutions. And they'll have to standardise them because we can't have 433 different kinds of contracts in India or Rwanda. We've got to have 2 or 3 to make this work. So there's some work to be done, don't get me wrong, but there's significant opportunity there. But bond markets are curious beasts. It's not like all additional. The way they work, and the good example is how Korea started its bond market in the 90s. You start with high-grade issuance, and investors get comfortable with the assets and comfortable with the bonds and start trading. Once investors are comfortable, they start developing an appetite. They say, ooh, I wouldn't mind a bit of high yield, they say. Rwanda, that looks like high yield. You get this amazing extension of appetite. In the green bonds market, which has grown from 3 billion in 2012, 11 billion last year, 35 billion this year of issuance, and we're on track for 100 billion next year of issuance. We now have pension funds phoning me up and say, can you get me some Brazilian real green bonds because I've got a Brazilian real fund? Can you get me some high yield risk stuff because I've got a small fund out here that's high yield? Now, the important thing to note is that 90% of their funds are low risk, high investment grade. It's only when they start filling up those pots and get it comfortable, they start to get appetite for the 10% that's high yield. The 10% that's high yield in an $88 trillion market is a lot of money in emerging markets. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So we have to get to a large and liquid market first before we're going to have really significant flow-on effect, although we're starting to see it now. The other thing about green bond is it brings together all sorts of investments under one umbrella, which is how you get large and liquid. Renewable energy efficiency, clean water for adaptation, transport infrastructure, and agriculture and forestry and supply chain. There's a bunch of assets. The key thing is, how do you know it's green? Are you being scammed? First thing to know is finance is made up of banks, sure, don't trust them, and institutional investors, pension funds and insurance funds who care deeply that it's the right sort of stuff because they're reporting to stakeholders like you. They're the ones with the money. They're the ones on our standards board telling us, make sure you get the science right about what is green. So we have this vast apparatus of academics and World Resource Institute defining what is green specifically to drive quality in the market. So that's how we're going to make sure that the right projects get funded, that we don't get crap projects getting funded, which is of course a big risk. But at the end of the day, it's a simple concept. But you've got to understand we need scale and liquidity to engage bond markets. If it's a $1 billion market or a $10 billion market, they say ho-hum. $100 billion market, everyone gets excited.
I think it's time to give the floor also to the audience, because now you have heard very, very different types of stories and points of views from very different scales of activity, and all addressing some parts of the same problem. But let's open the floor. Take, for instance, 3 questions at a time, collect them, and then questions or comments actually, and let the panel then respond. So I open the floor now. Hands up, please. The lady in red, I think, who's around, who has the roving microphones? Is there anybody? And please introduce yourself when you start.
Yes, I am Liliana Miranda. I am the Executive Director of the Cities for Life Forum from Lima, Peru. And I listened very interested in what you said. Even I was expecting more about microfinancing, because there is a lot we can do. I am an architect. Only changing the systems inside the houses, doing some simple changes, which may cost around $1,700 per house. And that's the most important part, because then we are saving energy instead of generating more and more and more to consume. And we are saving water instead of the same, more and more consumption. So we need to reduce consumption of energy and water, but also we need microfinancing. I mean, small credits for people to do things directly. The same thing that somebody said in the morning, something that we can do directly without these big systems and institutions, and which are going to take longer than 20 years to get fit and work. We may even ask the water company, the electricity company, to provide that loan to the people, and then in 12 months we will change and save 50% of the energy in the world. Maybe, I don't know. Let's do something like that. Let's try to force these kind of things and reinforce these kind of proposals.
Thank you, that was refreshing. Any more questions, comments?
Thank you. Hi, Amanda Bourne from Conservation International in South Africa. Similar to the previous comment, also maybe just to add another option, something that we're looking at around mobilizing private sector resources for climate change response in South Africa is working with some of the big industry bodies, so working with the Consumer Goods Council and the National Business Institute in South Africa to try, at the moment we're kicking off a capacity building process with some business leaders based on the long-term adaptation scenarios planning process in South Africa, as well as kind of bringing in business into national adaptation planning. But this will be looking very much at integrating sustainability and climate resilience criteria into industry standards, which then business will have to comply with and report on. So just another thing.
Thank you. There's one in front.
Hi, my name is Lisa Younghans from German Watch, and thanks for your very interesting remarks and comments. I have a specific questions to Mr. Nakoulima on the GCF. You said that cities are at the forefront of climate change, and I very much agree, but at the moment we do not have the access modalities for cities to access climate finance from the international level, such as the Adaptation Fund, the LDCF, or the Green Climate Fund. So my question is, would you envisage the Green Climate Fund to support cities directly, either through cities becoming a national implementing entities themselves, for example, or through, for example, setting up a national urban implementing entity that receives funding from the GCF and then spreads funding only to cities in the specific country? Thank you.
Let's collect one or two more hands. At the very back, there's at least one.
Hello, 1, 2. I'm Roberto. I just want to know how the zerozero is aligned to the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent coalition for 1 billion resilient people worldwide.
I'm sorry, I don't think we heard the question.
Okay, there is a coalition of the International Federation of Red Cross for 1 billion people, resilient people worldwide. So I would like to know how this zerozero initiative is aligned to the coalition.
This might be difficult to answer, actually. I don't really quite understand exactly about what the connection is, but we'll talk about that later. I said two more hands here.
Buenas tardes. De crisis climática y ecológica del Perú. Y el Perú. Los inversores van a pedir adecuar la ley de un país para que ellos puedan invertir, como Monsanto, que vende semillas. ¿Qué pueden decir ustedes a eso?
Would anybody be able to translate?
¿Puedo ver la pregunta para tratar de traducirla?
He was asking of the changes of the law. Maybe there is a need to change the legislation in one country to adequate the systems to benefit the investors, probably like Monsanto even, who sells seed.
But that's very much related to the enabling environment issues that we just had. I saw one more hand here. Let's finish this round and then we can go for another.
I'm Delphine Ganapin. I'm the global manager of the UNDP GEF Small Grants Program. And my question is to Ousseynou. I really like the news that there will be direct access for local NGOs for the Green Climate Fund. However, what we found out is that it's important to find a mechanism by which even the local NGOs who are newly formed, still building their capacity, can access, even including community-based organizations. Because the best way to empower a community or a local NGO is for them to really implement their own project rather than participating in a project of a big institution or be a participant, just a participant of a big project. So direct access, but the problem here from our own experience is that you have a lot of the most vulnerable, including indigenous peoples, women, even youth and children and the disabled, who do not know how to write proposals. Some of them even do not speak the national language. So how do we create then therefore a mechanism by which funds can still go to them, even though they still have to build their capacity, and a mechanism which takes risks, you know? And the main point is to empower them, not just to create the new technology or the sustainable development project, but really to empower them, to make them confident and become leaders of their own future. So I hope that the Green Climate Fund is taking a look at this, because from our own experience, this is where I think there's really a big need, because this is the missing element in a lot of development projects. This is the reason why the trickle-down approach really didn't work, because the trickle-down approach makes those at the bottom participants rather than the leaders of their own work. And usually the trickle-down approach is not willing to take risks and is not willing to take the additional work needed to be able to reach the grassroots.
It's obviously there's a lot of interest in the GCF at the moment. So let Ousseynou take a shot now, and then I think we'll get a few more questions, and then we'll get the whole panel to sort of react to the rest of them. But there are so many technical questions to you.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the input. I will address maybe let's say 3 points. First, enabling environment. Yes, that's key. And actually, the Green Climate Fund has been established very recently. Most of the staff joined the past, let's say, 3 months, but already the fund is operational, not financing projects or programs. This will come later next year, but already working on enabling environment, building capacity, and working with countries in order to identify the needs and to elaborate the support that will set the stage for the investments to come. And regarding the question of local NGOs as well as microfinance, our idea is the following. We want to give to these institutions direct access to the fund and not go through multiple layers of institutions. And we believe that even more important than the resources, what will be important is how we support them in the long term in a sustainable way so that they can make the most out of these resources. Yesterday we had a session with GIZ. We will have another session with a lot of many institutions, including UNDP, that provide this kind of support. And our idea would be that any entity that would access directly to the fund at the national or subnational level would benefit from a package of support that will make effective the local capacity. So that's, and we know it's a challenge, but we are very much mobilized on crafting the right type of support, and we need the expertise of all institutions that are already on the ground. Yes, so that was about enabling environment. The second point is about cities. Yeah, I confirm that cities, actually entities at the subnational level, at the cities level, can have access to the fund. And we are very keen on engaging with them. So this is also a message. Cities that have impactful projects and programs, and at the same time that have at their level entities that have the management capacities are very much invited to apply for accreditation at the fund and to share with us their projects and programs. And one of our objectives that we set to ourselves as a team would be at the first quarter next year to have at least one pilot program with the cities. And one way we want to do it would be to set up a kind of South-South learning exchange, because we have identified cities who are very much advanced in addressing climate change. So we are looking for other cities that want to share this experience, and we would be the matchmaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much for useful clarifications. I think many of us have been dying to hear these things, and we're finally getting clarity, so this is really an excellent opportunity. I saw a couple of more hands before I give the, because we have to finish in 10 minutes, so that's why I think let's have two. There was one hand at the, near the door.
Mi nombre es Balvino Benítez de Paraguay. Quería decir un tema muy importante, que los fondos lleguen a los productores en el campo, fuera de la participación de los gobiernos. Nuestra esperanza en este año internacional de la agricultura familiar es que los recursos disponibles en el mundo lleguen fuera de los gobiernos a los productores en el campo, que podría ser a través de los municipios locales. Sí. Un ejemplo, yo sembré soja orgánica, llegado la hora de cosechar, no tenía en dónde vender porque no tenía infraestructuras, silos, forma de limpiar para que los productores familiares puedan organizar su producción y vender alimentos sanos y formidables para el mundo. Entonces eso hay que considerar, porque nos nos limita producir alimentos sanos para el mundo a falta de infraestructuras. Entonces, el punto número 1 es cómo llegar a los pequeños productores en el campo. Una solución, una consideración es que a través de los municipios, fuera de la participación de los gobiernos. Hay dos cosas que no podríamos decir, pero que hay que decir porque así podemos mejorar. Los gobiernos saben que muchas veces limitan los recursos para hacer llegar al campo. Entonces eso hay que decir. Hoy día, en este año internacional, repito, nuestra esperanza es que lleguen los fondos en donde están los que trabajan las tierras. Gracias.
Thank you. Unfortunately, most of us don't have any translation facility at the moment. So the problem is I have been given exactly 5 minutes to finish. So Yuba, I think you wanted to ask a question. So let's.
Very quick questions, and then to put the panel in the context of zero. It's related to two fundamental issues. The potential availability of resources if it reaches the ambition, and the second, the absorptive capacity of the countries. Because those are the two fundamental issues if the panel can reflect on that.
Fine. I hope you caught Yuba's questions. I just heard this was actually the question in Paraguay was basically how do we ensure that these funds reach the beneficiaries, the small farmers. I think the big challenge of really sort of the trickling down, do we make sure that the intended beneficiaries actually are the ones who receive the benefits. I think now we have really a few minutes left, so let's go through quick comments from each one of you.
I'm going to take the one on how they reach the beneficiaries, which I think is related to your suggestion of using microfinance. So that, I think I agree, plays definitely a very important role in actually channeling these funds to local communities, households, cooperatives. And there are examples emerging where this is happening, specifically channeling climate finance. So Ethiopia, the Development Bank, channels finance to microfinance institutions, which then transfer money to households and cooperatives to invest in renewable energy. India is also using similar models to transfer funds to self-help groups. So that's money going directly to local communities. Nepal is an example which has also put in place a local adaptation framework which channels 80% of climate finance directly to local communities at the local level. I'll keep it short and pass.
I have a comment which is pretty much in line with what my colleague just said. I think we've been hearing about very different sizes of projects, very different size of funds, and maybe my last word would be to say that transformational doesn't only mean that we fund large projects, and that we have to keep in mind also that there's a lot of smaller projects that need to be bundled together and still be funded by international funds, however big they are.
Yes, maybe my final word would be that zero poverty, extreme poverty and zero emission, there's no contradiction, and I even think that it's a necessity. Without zero emission, or without aiming at zero emission, we may not achieve zero poverty, just because, as we saw in the previous examples, especially in Rwanda, climate change is threatening the most vulnerable populations. So by addressing zero emission, I think we are closer to the objective of zero extreme poverty. And I would just like to link it to some of the addresses that were done in the first day of this COP relating to some of our cultural ideas and ideals and concepts, meaning that however the level in the cities, in the rural areas, and whatever the social category, we should be respectful of our environment, and we should not impact our environment adversely. And I think when we talk about extreme poverty, it's not only economic poverty, but it's also the threatening our cultural and spiritual heritage.
My word is about ownership at the level of community, at the level of the country. In our case, we have very clear experiences of how these adaptation climate resilience projects are affecting real people and reducing poverty in the process. We have been fortunate in Rwanda to access the 10 million cap of adaptation fund, and predominantly the methodology used to deliver results is community-driven development approaches, enhancing climate resilience through market mechanisms that include cooperatives, include SMEs. We have a typical example of a project that has been sponsored by the fund itself, which actually developed loan schemes for rainwater harvesting in partnership with the bank. So it's just a broad project, but within the project, there are mechanisms to address institutional levels like schools, but also to bring in individuals who can afford to access loans through what we call SACCOs, to be able to access and buy rainwater harvesting units. So all of these things are possible. It's how you design the project, and that's why the fund has been specifically designed to be demand-driven, so that we can be able to identify opportunities to address poverty through some of these mechanisms like microfinances, like cooperatives. Thank you.
When I talk to my pension fund stakeholders in northern countries, I often talk about this story. Germany talks about a demographic time bomb. So does the US. So do the conservative politicians where I come from in Australia. Oh, the population is aging, there are no young people to earn the pensions anymore, the economies are going to go in the chute. But of course, we know in India, in Rwanda and Peru, there are plenty of young people. In fact, if you look at the global demographic shape, it's exactly perfect to have young people earning money to pay the pensions of the older, if you look internationally, rather than with our silly national boundaries that we still work within. And that's underpinning the discussions that we're having with international investors. The Norge Bank, the Norwegian pension fund, has recently made a decision to increase its investments in emerging markets in renewable energy significantly, specifically to get higher interest rates to earn more and to fulfill social objectives. That's what we need to see more of. Young people in countries like Peru do need capital. If they get capital and if they get the trust that comes with that investment, and we need to find ways to make that happen, they will return those pension funds for those Gerbans who are getting older and need to be able to pay for their pensions later. And that's the opportunity presenting ourselves at the moment. Yes, it requires education. Yes, it requires skills. Yes, it requires systems of justice. We all know that. But in the meantime, when you look at COP and you get depressed, as you will at the end of this particular COP, as you will in Paris, I'm already anticipating depression, hey, mainly because I know Congress won't agree to anything. So it's kind of academic, there's not going to be any binding agreement. Then, remember, there is another place to look. There's another narrative where we can move fast, we can move quickly, and we have, in many societies, done it before. There is still hope.
Thank you very much. And now I really have to finish because the next session needs to start. So I have first of all, I'm not trying to summarize. It has been an extremely rich discussion, and I hope that this has inspired you and given you some, and I, like Alex actually said, everything's possible. So let's believe that. And while before we thank the panelists, I'd just like to let you know that the next session starts 4:15 sharp, and Simon and Bettina are asked to come here to do a quick pitch. So while they're walking towards the podium, let me thank wholeheartedly our panelists and hope that you have enjoyed the show. Thanks.